let's get on to the show. We've got three behavior analysts with, I would say, very unique, but also complementary backgrounds here with Nick, Maddie, and John. So without further ado, I will turn it over to them to take it away.
Hello, welcome everybody. Nathan, thank you for the introduction. And this is another continuing education event presented by DBHDS. As Nathan mentioned, I'm joined here by my colleagues, Maddie Bellissimo and Nick Vanderberg. And we are excited to present a training titled Treatment of Challenging Behavior for Adults with Developmental Disabilities, a review of literature. We have a lot of material to cover, but please feel free to place questions in the chat and we will hope to get to them at the very end. We will be using an online survey polling tool called Poll Everywhere. That information was sent in an email yesterday, but you'll also be able to access it throughout the training. All right, so today we will discuss research patterns and treatment of problem behavior by looking at treatment effects of interventions and research, and we will discuss and identify antecedent consequent-based interventions used in applied research. Research patterns in the treatment of adults with problem behavior and intellectual and developmental disabilities, a quantitative systematic review by Bokar and colleagues. To answer questions about trends in problem behavior, treatment literature, and treatment types, the authors conducted a systematic review of peer-reviewed and grade literature, such as dissertations. We thought it would be interesting to examine the articles based off this systematic review and present some examples of the research findings for the purposes of this training. We will only be focusing on antecedent and reinforcement-based interventions. Using a robust Boolean string, we searched across 5 databases across 2002 and 2022. Through their screening process, the search results were whittled down to 76 articles, which you can see here when they started, it was almost 18,000. Treatment types were labeled based on how the original author tackled the procedures, which resulted in 29 different categories. These were categorized under antecedent, reinforcement, and punishment procedures. 66% of the sample employed multi-protocol treatments, such as antecedent interventions with consequent-based reinforcement procedures, or functional communication training with extinction, as an example. They found, through a statistical analysis of comparing baseline to treatment, that effect sizes were larger for multi-protocol treatments compared to single protocol treatments. Due to technical difficulties, we are going to skip this poll everywhere activity. We'll try and review the next one, but essentially, we're looking at ranking the most common interventions found in treatment literature for adults with challenging behavior, and the top 4 that were found in the article were 4 non-contingent reinforcement, choice, prompting, and environmental enrichment. We'll be focusing on examples of these in this training in no particular order. Fisher and Brown conducted a study with a man in his 30s diagnosed with Huntington's disease, a neurodegenerative disease, who engaged in multiple forms of aggression with low levels of verbal behavior. An interdisciplinary team that consisted of a neuropsychologist, speech pathologist, and an occupational therapist assessed and developed a plan. They initially worked on increasing independence with leisure and activities of daily living, using backwards chaining, which increased independence, but it did not decrease aggression. The team assessed antecedents to aggression and preference for calming sensory activities. A sensory modulation plan was developed and led by the occupational therapist on the team. It involved staff prompting the individual to engage in calming activities identified in a preference assessment when he showed signs of agitation. For example, if the individual engaged in precursor behaviors when in a loud environment, staff would prompt the individual to take a break and offer choice to engage in a calming activity. While the plan was implemented, behavior data were tracked. A behavior support plan was implemented later, and it focused on antecedent strategies, including minimizing prompts during meals, setting the individual up with activities, and simplifying prompts to allow the person to respond as a listener and choose an alternative activity. In the baseline condition, aggression was variable, and occurred as many as 16 times per week. During this sensory modulation condition, aggression decreased to 4 to 6 times per week. Lastly, during the combined sensory modulation and behavior support condition, aggression reduced further to a maximum of 2 times per week. As a behavior analyst, it was interesting to see how these practitioners implement an intervention that is a bit different from what we typically see in applied behavior analysis conventional literature. Nevertheless, I like the collaboration across the interdisciplinary team to develop and implement what seemed to be an effective plan for this individual. All right, environmental enrichment typically involves providing tangibles non-contingently to individuals in treatment, and is often paired with other interventions. Environmental enrichment was first coined by Horner in a 1980 study where enrichment was used to decrease problem behavior and increase adaptive behavior. It could be referred to as non-contingent reinforcement, object manipulation, and or using matched or competing stimuli to reduce problem behavior. The idea of environmental enrichment has evolved since its inception in 1980. It is rare to see this term in literature as it's branched off into more specific technologies. It is commonly applied to behavior maintained by automatic reinforcement, which is what we'll focus on today. All right, now let's take a look at some research utilizing environmental enrichment. As we mentioned before, there would be some overlap of interventions in the articles reviewed. The study the efficacy of non-contingent reinforcement as treatment for automatically reinforced stereotypy by Britton et al. Aimed to systematically evaluate the effectiveness of NCR in 2 conditions by presenting individuals with predetermined competing leisure stimuli that were freely available. The study incorporated 3 participants, each engaging in one form of stereotypy that consisted of head rocking, face rubbing, or repetitive hand movements. Following FA, a multiple stimulus preference assessment was completed to identify leisure items that could match the stimulation provided by the stereotypy. The participants were then exposed to 2 conditions. You can see on the graph stereotypy is notated by the open circles here, and object manipulation with closed. In one condition, the leisure item was placed on the table in front of the participants, and there was no verbal instruction. In the other condition, the experimenter prompted the participants to interact with the leisure items by handing the item to them at the beginning of the session. All participants engaged in higher levels of object manipulation when they were prompted to engage with the items. Looking at Brian's results, you could see, using a reversal design across conditions, that prompted NCR was more effective than unprompted NCR. Takeaways from this is that object manipulation may compete with automatically maintained behavior, and that prompting may be required to reduce response effort of interacting with competing stimuli. The article, Treatment Efficacy of Non-Contingent Reinforcement during Brief and Extended Application, looks at the therapeutic effects of non-contingent reinforcement over longer stretches of time, and whether satiation would be prevented through the use of multiple reinforcer or reinforcer variation. This study assessed the manipulation of low preference and high preference items to decrease self-induced behavior. The article features 2 different experiments. In experiment 1, 2 adults with developmental disabilities participated. The dependent variable is object manipulation, which was defined as holding or physically manipulating an item. During the first phase, a pairwise preference assessment was conducted with 10 items as described by Fisher et al. Items were then ranked from left to right based on the percentage of trials the item was selected, as you can see here on the graph to the left. For example, for Matthew, beads and string was the number 1 high preference item. For Angela, coloring book was the number 1 high preference item. You can also see for Angela there are 3 high preference items, which I will talk about on the next slide. Also, low preference items were also identified. Excuse me. Phase 2 incorporated a brief NCR evaluation that were 10 minutes in length. During baseline, only the low preference item was available. while during the NCR condition, both items were available. In baseline, the low preference item was manipulated almost continuously. When both items were available, the participants manipulated the high preference item. This phase served as a prerequisite for the extended NCR evaluation. The extended NCR evaluation was 120 minutes in length. Each 120-minute section equals 6 data points. You can see this here, that there's a break in the data. That is a 120-minute section, each data point representing 20 minutes. The first condition was identical to the condition in phase 2, except that it was longer. Highly preferred items were indicated by the closed squares, while low preference items were indicated by the open circles. As you can see for Matthew, he was pretty content engaging and manipulating the number one high preference item, leading the authors to not make any changes in treatment. A reversal to an NCR varied condition, which included 3 high preference items along with low preference items, included for Angela due to satiation. You can see towards the end of the extended sessions, the satiation set in. She began manipulating the low preference items indicated there, here, and here. The graphs show that there was a strong preference for the high preferred item, but as time went on, her manipulation of low preference items increased. When she was presented with 3 high preference items, the low preference items were rarely manipulated. The purpose of experiment 2 was to determine if NCR would remain effective when used as an intervention to decrease self-interest behavior during 2-hour sessions applied throughout the day. The study also set out to investigate if access to varied reinforcers would ameliorate the effects of satiation when an NCR procedure was implemented. The primary dependent variables was self-interest behavior and object manipulation. First, an FA was conducted to determine if self-interest behavior was maintained by automatic reinforcement. Next, a preference assessment was completed to determine if items that would compete with self-interest behavior were available. Duration for object manipulation is on the primary y-axis, which you can see off the left, and SIB responses per minute, as well as per interval on the secondary y-axis. The graph shows an inverse relation between object manipulation, indicated by the black squares, and self-interest behavior, indicated by the open triangles. During the NCR evaluation, the individual had access to the highly preferred item associated with the highest duration of manipulation and lowest SIB rate. Object manipulation is indicated by open circles, and SIB was closed. The reversal design shows that when the highly preferred items were presented, they competed with automatically maintained self-interest behavior, which you can see here at baseline, higher levels of self-interest behavior, lower levels of self-interest behavior in the NCR condition when the person was manipulating those items, and that was replicated across the participants. Next, 120-minute sessions, just like the previous experiment, were introduced to evaluate the effects of NCR over a longer period of time. NCR constant condition was identical to the previous condition in which the participant had continuous access to the most preferred item. An NCR varied condition was introduced for 2 participants in which the person was getting access to several items that corresponded with high manipulation and low levels of self-interest behavior. Looking at the graphs, you will see object manipulation represented with the open circles and SIB measured with closed. Like the previous experiment, each data point represents 20 minutes in a 120-minute session. Julie's SIB remained low while having constant access to the number one high preference items, which you can see above here. Laura's data tells a different story, indicating that she became satiated when she had the same item over an extended period of time. You can see that self-interest behavior increased. It's more variable. However, when she was provided with numerous items, her SIB decreased to lower levels, which you can see here in the NCR varied condition, lower levels of SIB, till it's been replicated. Robert's levels of SIB were varied across both conditions, though object manipulation was constant. The literature shows that for some individuals, object manipulation of high preferred items may decrease automatically maintained self-interest behavior across long periods of time, resembling a more feasible natural implementation for treatment. Okay. I'd like to take a moment to offer some considerations when implementing an enriched environment as a treatment. Gerber et al. Conducted a review of the efficacy of environmental enrichment as treatment for problem behavior maintained by automatic reinforcement. Interventions alone were considered effective if problem behavior was reduced by at least 80% from baseline levels. Studies with alternative treatment components were separated into alternative behavior manipulations, such as use of prompting, reinforcement, and/or problem behavior manipulations, such as blocking, restraint. Of the 159 cases that were included in enrichment alone, 40.9% showed that problem behavior decreased by 80% or greater. This may indicate that environmental enrichment alone may not be enough to reduce problem behavior to a significant level. The overall average decrease in problem behavior was 57.5%. Studies that included multi-protocol treatments resulted in lower reduction of problem behavior, which is a common theme in this presentation. Here are some things to consider. Environmental enrichment may be enhanced by including matched or competing stimuli. Prior to using tangibles for treatment, consider if they have any effect on problem behavior at all by conducting a competing or matched stimulus assessment. Environmental enrichment resembles a control condition or a play condition in a functional analysis. By conducting an experimental analysis with a ignore as your test and a play as your control condition, you may be able to get a preview into the effects of environmental enrichment on problem behavior. All right, thank you so much. And now I'm going to welcome my colleague, Nick.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Get set up here. Awesome. So like I said, my name's Nick, and for my portion of today's talk, we're going to be finishing up our selection of antecedent interventions. We're going to be looking at some articles on non-contingent reinforcement and providing client choice, and then we're going to transition to consequence interventions. But first, let's continue our look into NCR with a project done by Newman and colleagues, which compared two types of NCR. The first used the maintaining reinforcer of escape that was identified in a functional analysis, and the other NCR used an arbitrary reinforcer, which was an edible, and this was not identified as maintaining problem behavior. They compared these two types of NCR with extinction and without extinction. Let's see what they found. All right, here are those results. So in each corner here, you're going to see a graphical display of the target behaviors for each of the 4 participants over a separate graph of their percent compliance. The closed triangles, they represent NCR using that arbitrary reinforcer of an edible. And the open circles, they represent NCR using the maintaining reinforcer, which remember was escape. So NCR with that maintaining consequence of escape, but without extinction, was effective in decreasing aggression for 3 of the 4 participants. And you can see those graphs there in the green boxes. And the arbitrary NCR without extinction was effective for 2 out of the 4. But for one participant, Timmy, seen here in this blue box, extinction was added because problem behavior did not decrease to a clinically acceptable level during the NCR without extinction. But by the end of this treatment phase with the added extinction, his SIB decreased to 0 levels for both the arbitrary NCR and the NCR with escape. So the researchers concluded here that NCR using an arbitrary reinforcer may offer an alternative and effective approach for treating escape-maintained problem behavior when extinction cannot be implemented. That's an interesting, maybe a useful result for you because, as we all know, it can be difficult to achieve extinction in a real-world setting like a group home, adult day program. And these results suggest that it isn't always necessary to achieve a meaningful behavior change. So you may want to store this result in your behavior change toolbox the next time you're using NCR. All right, next we have another study on NCR by Michelle Wallace and a few other authors that you may recognize. They explored dense versus thin schedules of NCR, and they saw how they could have a differing effect on problem behavior and how thinning these schedules influence responding. They conducted 2 studies with 3 people living in a state residential facility for adults with intellectual disabilities. Let's see what they found. All right, the first study's results shown here on the left, they looked at dense versus thin schedules. So baseline and NCR conditions were alternated in a multi-element design. One therapist provided NCR on a thin, fixed time, 5-minute schedule, and those data are shown in the closed circles. And then another therapist delivered the reinforcer on a dense fixed time schedule, which was nearly continuous. So lots of reinforcement. And that is shown in the open circles, and this was thinned across sessions. The results were a bit surprising to me. They found that problem behavior decreased in similar ways for both the thin and the dense schedules. The second study included the same participants at the first, but it compared the NCR schedule thinning with and without extinction. So the 2 dense schedules of NCR were implemented, one with extinction, one without. The 2 schedules were alternated again on that multi-element design. And they found that dense schedules of NCR with extinction decreased the problem behavior for all of the participants. And it appeared to reduce behavior by altering the motivating operations that occasioned the responding. Or in other words, with the dense schedule of NCR, problem behavior was reduced because the reinforcer was repeatedly provided independent of occurrences of the problem behavior. So, in the dense schedule of NCR without extinction had no effect on one participant's behavior, Susan, seen in that bottom graph. Overall, the researchers concluded that low rates of problem behavior under NCR schedules, under thin NCR schedules, were a direct function of extinction. The authors also provided some great practical applications that you can take with you for the next time you're designing a NCR protocol. First, when using extinction when using extinction is not feasible, NCR is most effective on a dense schedule to alterate the motivating operations in place and reduce problem behavior. And on the other side, the effectiveness of a thin schedule of NCR may be dependent on being used with extinction. And additionally, a thin schedule might help you teach functionally equivalent replacement behavior as a motivating operation is still in place on a thin schedule. So this is good to know if you're ever using NCR while teaching replacement behaviors. All right, the next example of NCR in the research, we're doing a deep dive on NCR here. Wilder and colleagues used it to target a particularly difficult behavior to treat rumination. This behavior can be dangerous as it involves regurgitating and swallowing previously digested food and lead to inflammation of the esophagus, tooth decay, and other medical complications. This study had one participant, a 37-year-old man with autism. He had a long 15-year history of engaging in rumination. A functional analysis was conducted, and they found that his rumination was maintained by automatic reinforcement. The researchers were interested in evaluating an alternative to food-based antecedent-based interventions typically used to address rumination. Instead, they used a flavor spray. This was designed to be used by dieters as a food substitution. A preference assessment was conducted with all the different types of flavor spray, and apple pie was victorious over barbecue and birthday cake flavors, which I think was a pretty solid choice. So let's see how these flavor spray was able to influence this participant's rumination. All right, they found during baseline rumination occurred about 2.8 times per minute. And in the first apple spray fixed time 20-second condition, the rumination dropped by about half to 1.2 occurrences per minute. So a nice drop there. They returned to baseline, and it showed a marked increase in rumination when compared to the 2 flanking treatment phases. Researchers continued to tweak the schedule of reinforcement until landing on a self-administered spray on a 10-second fixed time. Even though it just had one participant, this study does provide some support for a cheaper and calorie-free alternative to the food satiation treatment of rumination. And it also suggests a flavor spray provided on a fixed time schedule can reduce rumination in adults with developmental disabilities. Let's move on to the next study and our final look into NCR's presence in the research and our first peek into providing choice, which we're going to talk about a bit. So Philip and Munford, they assessed the use of NCR, which included activity choice for a 24-year-old male living in a residential setting who engaged in aggression. The dependent variable here was the rate of regression, and the intervention conditions consisted of extinction plus activity choice, extinction plus NCR, and then extinction plus both activity and NCR. So the results, they show a decreasing trend in behavior for all the treatment phases, shown here in the blue boxes. But if you see, there is a more notable treatment effect seen here in these blue boxes when NCR was combined with environmental enrichment, in this case, a choice of activity. So providing choice is a simple person-centered treatment option, and these results suggest that it can be effective. It can be a particularly effective behavior change tool when used in combination with NCR. All right, so let's keep on looking at choice here for a bit. And this is our last look into antecedent interventions. And this study is out of the University of Arizona. It was conducted at a community-based day program. And these researchers evaluated the effectiveness of a systematic process of aligning behavioral interventions with identified functions of problem behaviors. And this was done with 3 adults with developmental disabilities. They use this process called the function-based intervention decision model. This model has been used previously on children in a school setting, but the researchers in this study used it with adult participants to develop function-based interventions based on an FBA. And we're going to be mainly looking at 2 participants here, and that's Lewis and Max. They each received treatment packages that included providing choice to address inappropriate comments. All right, and Lewis's inappropriate comments was thought to be maintained by access to attention and accessing preferred tasks. His interventions included initially ignoring those inappropriate behaviors, and then once he was seated for a minute, providing him with a choice of a preferred activity. And Max's inappropriate comments were thought to be maintained by avoiding attention and non-preferred tasks. And he was offered a new task at least 2 times with each sessions. Let's see how these treatment packages were able to change the participants' behavior. So on the left here, we have appropriate interactions in the open circles and inappropriate interactions in the closed circles. On the right, we have percentage of appropriate comments. And Lewis's graphs are at the top, and Max, you'll find his data at the bottom. And as you can see, for both Max and Lewis, the interventions were effective at increasing appropriate interactions and decreasing those inappropriate interactions. And the results seem to continue during the 3 maintenance check-ins done weeks after the study. So I think a good takeaway for this study is that a simple adjustment of providing choice can fit really nicely into a function-based treatment package, particularly when implemented in an adult day program, as this study suggests. All right, so we're not going to do the scanning for the poll everywhere. If you want, just go ahead and use the Q&A and use the chat feature and answer this question. So let's see, what do you think was the top consequence-based reinforcement intervention found in the literature review that John introduced us to?
And I do have poll everywhere activated. You just won't be able to see it on our screen.
Oh, okay.
We can read
That's a good way. Yeah. That's a good way to do it.
All right, looks like differential reinforcement, DRA, is number 1 so far.
Yeah, let's check the chat out, see what we've got on the chat.
DRA still holding strong. No wrong answer.
DRA, a lot of DRA. We're going to talk about that. And we're only going to be talking about reinforcement-based consequence interventions today. Lots of DRA.
Yeah, and to be fair, I think we were a little surprised by the results in the literature.
And actually, I don't see the top answer that is actually in the study. So let's check that out. Thank you, everybody, for participating. I'm sure
shows DRA as the most.
Yeah, that was definitely the runaway winner. Let's look at the results from the study. So these are the results based on the literature review done by Kokar et al. So FCT, general positive reinforcement, were the runaway winners at the top, and then differential reinforcement and alternative and 0 rates of behavior rounded off the top 4. So let's take a deeper look at some of these consequence interventions, starting with FCT. So we're going to look at a couple systematic reviews of FCT. Starting with Kirks and colleagues, they looked at the use of FCT as a treatment for problem behavior with people with intellectual disabilities to see if it met the criteria of an evidence-based practice as defined by the American Psychological Association. And they found that FCT, it went above and beyond the criteria to be labeled a well-established treatment for the behavior in the ID population in children and met the criteria for probably effective with adults. And then in 2019, Emily Gregory and friends did another systematic review, specifically looking at FCT's efficacy with an adult population with autism. And they used the What Works Clearinghouse design and evidence standards. They found that 8 studies had moderate or strong evidence of effectiveness, but ultimately concluded that the state of the literature at the time provided the basis for the efficacy of FCT in adults, but recommended additional research in the area. So overall, these studies found that FCT is well established in the research. So let's take a look at the research base says about some best practices when implementing it. So when problem behavior is maintained by social consequences, we're able to, as behavior analysts, to modify those consequences to reduce problem behavior and promote a more appropriate alternative. One of the most commonly used options here is functional communication training. And it typically consists of 2 important components. First, it provides a consequence maintaining problem behavior contingent on appropriate communication response. And second, it no longer delivers that consequence contingent on problem behavior, also known as extinction. The first component is going to be important because you want to make sure the person still has a means to access that identified reinforcer. If you totally remove it, it's just going to cause deprivation and it may actually evoke the problem behavior. And you also want to make sure to match the reinforcer identified in the FBA in your FCT protocol. Don't use attention in the FC protocol when the behavior is maintained by escape. The second component of extinction is important because this is going to reduce the probability of the problem behavior and because it no longer has access to reinforcement. All right. And the work done by Horner and Day, they came up with some good recommendations when choosing and teaching a specific FCT response, which is a very important part in the protocol. And the first thing is you want to keep it simple. So an easy to complete response is more effective than a more effortful response. But you also want to make sure that response is still able to be recognized by the people they're speaking to or communicating with. So consider selecting a single word or a short sentence response to reinforce over a more complex sentence. You can work your way towards that more complex sentence later on. And next, FCT is most effective at reducing problem behavior when it's reinforced on a dense schedule of reinforcement versus a thin schedule. So be sure to provide that identified consequence for every instance of FCT response, if possible, especially early on in the learning process. And lastly, make sure you provide that reinforcer as quickly as possible. We know that a closer a reinforcer is to a behavior, the more effective it is going to be at increasing it. Same here for FCT. Get in there quick, provide that reinforcer. So you definitely want to consider these recommendations when implementing FCT. It can be complicated to do correctly, so you may need a training plan as well, and it may require some elements of behavior skills training to make sure this intervention is implemented with fidelity. So that is it for my portion of today's talk. I don't know if death by equal interval line graph is possible, but I'm sure we're all getting pretty close to it. But Maddie is going to bring us home. She got some really great information to share with you, some interesting stuff. So I'm going to kick it off over to her so she can finish up reinforcement-based interventions.
Researchers successfully were able to treat life-threatening pica in a 19-year-old man named Jim, who wore a protective helmet with a face shield to mitigate his pica. Despite this, Jim had ingested latex gloves prior to the study, which required emergency surgery. Jim also had a history of engaging in physical aggression when his pica was blocked. Previous interventions involved being placed in secluded environments, management with psychotropic medications, that helmet with a face shield, and one-to-one direct supervision. Prior to the study, medical causes were ruled out or treated, and the team conducted a functional analysis to confirm the hypothesis of automatically maintained pica. They also conducted preference assessments to identify preferred edible items and activities, and implemented a multi-component intervention. So let's see what they found. The graph here displays the interventions that researchers implemented with Jim, with items ingested represented by the open squares and items appropriately discarded in the closed circles. Baseline was conducted in the same room as the FA, which was baited with safe but inedible items, such as paper pieces. NCR was the same as baseline, except highly preferred edible items were placed in a bowl in the middle of the room. In the increased response effort, or RE condition, Jim's protective helmet was applied prior to his entering the room. Jim could still engage in pica by lifting the face shield. In the baseline with receptacle condition, a garbage receptacle was placed in the room. These interventions had little effect on the number of edible items ingested, so researchers then implemented a DRI praise-only condition signaled by the DRI-1 phase. This consisted of a verbal prompt, paper goes in the garbage. If Jim placed inedible items in the receptacle, he was given immediate social praise. While this had some effect, pica still occurred. So in the response blocking phase, a chin guard and adjustable straps were added to his helmet so that Jim could not engage in pica. And during that DRI-2 condition, discarded responses were followed by immediate social praise and a brief 10 to 30 second access to preferred activities. During the generalization phase, the helmet straps were loosened each session until the helmet was able to be removed, and the DRI with praise and preferred activities remained. Jim practiced in new environments and with new caregivers. During the maintenance probes over the next 5 years, Jim's ingestion of inedible items remained low to zero, and he was actually able to transition back into the community, where he was able to participate in community activities, spend time with his family, and spend unsupervised time for parts of the day. Social validity measures as administered to Jim's family showed that his family had positive reactions to his treatment and perceived long-term benefits of it. So let's move on to this study by Scabelli and colleagues. They published this case study on a young adult in an intensive school setting. Dwayne was an 18-year-old man diagnosed with ASD who enjoyed social intention while playing with interactive games, being greeted by novel adults, and exploring his environment. He often exhibited high-intensity, challenging behavior, such as aggression, self-injury, dropping to the ground, and property destruction, as well as some motor stereotypy, disrobing, and urinary incontinence. Dwayne was of large stature and presented with frequent and intense aggression and property destruction, which had caused serious injuries to his care providers and presented a risk to fellow students. Aggressive and destructive behavior occurred throughout the day and many times during transitions within and outside of the classroom. Due to his size and strength, as many as 8 care providers were sometimes needed to complete transitions without incident. An FBA using indirect and direct observation methods was conducted, and researchers determined that Dwayne's behavioral outbursts were actually maintained by access to preferred tangible objects and by escape from interactions with care providers when they attempted to block his movement. Transition requests from his care providers also appeared to evoke behavior outbursts, particularly later in the school day and when it was time to exit the classroom and be transported home. So care providers delivered this multi-component intervention, which consisted of antecedent and consequence interventions. Firstly, care providers minimized verbal and physical contact during precursor behaviors. The transition requests that were consistently associated with behavior outbursts were removed from Dwayne's classroom schedule temporarily in favor of requests that he could complete successfully. When Dwayne did transition successfully, caregivers delivered continuous positive attention. At the end of day transition request, Dwayne was asked to leave the classroom for home, and during the intervention, this was preceded by a 5 to 10 minute period of engaging Dwayne in pleasurable activities to establish behavioral momentum. A preferred care provider was with him throughout that end-of-day transition, offering him an edible snack while ambulating successfully and maintaining a safe distance to encourage independence and prevent aggression. Staff encouraged Dwayne to make requests, for example, "I'm finished," and "break." Attention from and interactions with care providers was provided when Dwayne was seated in his area with his particular furniture and not moving around the classroom, when he was handling instructional materials appropriately and completing tasks that were incompatible with those behaviors targeted for decrease. Staff allowed Dwayne to make choices like pausing briefly while ambulating, such as looking into another classroom, greeting other people, and carrying materials during transitions. Reinforcers were changed daily to increase the motivational value and to incorporate novel stimuli that Dwayne enjoyed. So Dwayne's caregivers, we discussed, reduced the number of transition requests during the behavior intervention phase. This graph shows the number of requests that were provided to Dwayne throughout the study. Dwayne was prescribed psychotropic medication during the study, and researchers were able to increase the number of transition requests per day during this phase. In the second graph, Dwayne's percentage of successful transitions are graphed here on the y-axis. To be recorded as a success, Dwayne had to initiate and complete the transition as requested by his providers independently and without a behavior outburst. You can see high variability in both the baseline and behavior intervention conditions. About 2 weeks after aripiprazole was added to the behavioral intervention, Dwayne's successful transitions increased and became less variable. As time went on and medications were adjusted, successful transitions remained above baseline levels, but became more variable than earlier in the behavior intervention and medication condition. At the 1 and 2 month follow-ups, successful transitions remained above 90%. This is my favorite graph where Dwayne's restraint duration is graphed here on the y-axis. You can see that during the behavior intervention condition, restraint duration variability decreased slightly, and Dwayne's caregivers saw several runs of consecutive days with 0 minutes of restraint. And those restraint levels reduced to 0 levels within days after his medication was added and remained at 0 during the variability in his successful transitions. So basically, while Dwayne had some unsuccessful transitions during that behavior intervention and medication phase, restraint was still not necessary. So 0 levels of restraint continued at his 1 and 2 month follow-ups, which was after experimenters had handed off his intervention to his natural supports. All right, let's move on to Stacey Carter's study here, in which she evaluated the effects of a pica exchange procedure in reducing the ingestion of edible items like small metal objects, staples, paper clips, strings of fabric, and candy wrappers. The participant was named Barbara, and she was a 72-year-old woman with IDD living in a state residential facility. She used a wheelchair to ambulate, and her pica was defined as picking up and moving a non-edible item to within less than 6 inches of her mouth. Pica exchange was defined as placing a non-edible item in the hand of a staff member and receiving an edible item in return. Her edible items for training were determined using a pairwise preference assessment, and researchers compared edible and non-edible items in that assessment and actually found that Barbara preferred edible items such as chocolate, cookies, and coffee over the inedible items. So here, a BAB reversal design was used to evaluate her treatment. During the training phase, Barbara had to exchange the pica item within arm's reach within 10 seconds of an initial request. So the staff member was right there for her. If this did not happen, a prompt sequence of gesture, verbal, and physical prompts were used. All pica attempts were blocked. The goal was to shape the pica exchange behavior to naturally occurring situations when a staff member might not be around to receive the pica item and deliver that reinforcer right away. The response effort was measured using the approximate distance between the individual and the staff members. That was the distance that Barbara needed to travel with her wheelchair to complete the exchange. The graph to the left shows the frequency of pica, and the graph to the right shows the percentage of accuracy in the exchange across the trials. The response effort increased by starting at an exchange distance of just 1 meter and ending with over 5 meters of distance to a different room. The researchers highlighted an interesting finding as they increased that response effort that Barbara needed to travel for the pica exchange. With only one exception, each first session after the distance Barbara was required to move increased. Barbara allocated more responses to pica attempts and less to pica exchanges, but this effect stabilized as sessions within the phase continued. So you can see her exchange came back up and her pica came back down further in the phase. Research prior to this study suggested that responding for pica or alternative behavior was correlated to the response effort required for each. And while this study demonstrated similar results, the data indicate that an increase in pica was temporal or reactionary to the initial increase in response effort. The author discusses how individuals displaying automatically reinforced behavior can actually shift their response allocation to more effortful alternative behavior over extended periods of training. The study, a comparison of various forms of reinforcement with and without extinction as a treatment for escape maintain problem behavior, was conducted by the same author as the previous study. The purpose was to replicate previous research by comparing the effects of positive and negative reinforcement, both with and without extinction, on levels of compliance with a 19-year-old with escape maintain behavior. The study investigated whether providing other forms of positive reinforcement, like low preference edible items and high preference leisure items, contingent on compliance, while reinforcing destructive behavior with short breaks from the demand, would result in reductions of problem behavior. Items measured were destructive behavior, which included aggression like slapping, pushing, hitting, headbutting, and disruption in the form of throwing and destroying items. Compliance was defined as completing a self-care demand within 5 seconds of a verbal prompt. 10-second partial interval data were collected. A paired choice preference assessment was conducted for food and leisure items prior to treatment. Edible items were divided into the categories of high preference and low preference. High preference leisure items consisted of stickers and 30 seconds of music for this participant. So I'm going to move from the left to the right here. The functional analysis is depicted on the leftmost graph and showed that destructive behavior was maintained by escape from self-care demands like putting on a jacket and removing shoes. The demand condition consisted of a least to most prompting hierarchy with model and physical assistance delivered every 30 seconds to complete the self-care demand, descriptive praise for compliance, and a 30-second break for destructive behavior. So in the middle graph, the baseline condition was identical to that demand condition I just described in the FA. Compliance is notated by the closed diamonds, with destructive behavior notated by the open squares. During the next condition, the therapist delivered highly preferred edible items contingent on compliance with a self-care demand. If the individual engaged in destructive behavior, he still received a 30-second break from the demand. After a reversal to baseline conditions, the same intervention was repeated with similar results. Destructive behavior was low and compliance was high, even though destructive behavior was continued to be reinforced by brief escape from demands. In the last condition in the middle graph, the therapist delivered escape from the demand contingent upon either compliance with the demand or destructive behavior, and she observed responding similar to baseline conditions. In the follow-up treatment analysis on the rightmost graph, delivering highly preferred leisure items contingent on compliance sustained the levels observed in the high preference edible stage, even as the therapist continued to reinforce destructive behavior with those brief breaks from demands. However, delivering low preference edible items in this last phase did not maintain high levels of compliance. So the takeaway here is that escape extinction might be difficult to implement with individuals who display severe forms of aggression. In this study, extinction was not necessary to reduce problem behavior. Highly preferred leisure items, though not the functional reinforcer for destructive behavior, increased compliance with demands and decreased problem behavior that was maintained by escape from demands. Thank you all so much for attending our session today and for holding in there while we solved our technical issues. I want to give a big thank you to Courtney Pernick for her contributions to the conception, content, and production of this event, and reminder to look out for and complete that survey for CEUs. Thanks again, everyone.